are in the war room late at night. Dashboards are glowing, people are on headsets, but the logo on the big screen is not one of your crown jewel platforms. It is a modest software as a service SaaS note-taking tool that a single product team adopted years ago, now quietly wired into identity, chat, and document storage. Overnight, the vendor has disclosed a breach. What started as just a third-party advisory is turning into your incident. Tokens need to be revoked, suspicious grants must be reviewed, and senior leaders want to know why an obscure app has tendrils in everything that matters. This is a Wednesday headline feature from Bare Metal Cyber magazine, developed by Bare Metal Cyber, and it is about what happens next. The uncomfortable reality is that this scenario is no longer an edge case. Over the past few years, many organizations have drifted from a tidy list of cloud platforms into a dense, interconnected fabric of services. The big platforms are still there, but each of them hosts its own marketplace of extensions, bots, and connectors. Teams stitch them together with one-click sign-in-with flows, low-code and no-code automation, and convenience features that promise to save time. On paper, it all looks like a simple portfolio. In practice, it behaves like an ecosystem, and ecosystems produce emergent behavior that no one person designed. The most dangerous parts of that ecosystem are rarely the flagship systems you negotiate at the executive level. Risk often hides in the long tail of just a small tool that gains surprising reach once it is integrated. A sales helper that plugs into mail and calendars. A niche analytics service that connects to your data warehouse. A workflow product that links chat, document storage, and ticketing in one place. None of these feels catastrophic on its own, yet together they create more paths through which identity and sensitive data can move. When one of them is compromised, attackers are not breaching a side system. They are stepping into the middle of your mesh. What makes this even harder is how quietly the mesh grows. Most SaaS adoption starts as a local, reasonable decision. A manager approves a free trial to keep a team moving. An engineer installs an app from a marketplace because it solves a nagging problem. An executive says yes to a vendor's standard permission set rather than slowing a project down. Every step is understandable in isolation, but almost no one keeps a living model of the resulting dependency graph. When a breach happens, the first questions are basic but brutal to answer quickly. Where is this app actually installed? Whose identities does it touch? Which data flows through it, and which processes depend on it today? That opacity is the precursor to every ugly chain reaction. When a small SaaS tool turns into a big incident, it is tempting to call the outcome a fluke. In reality, most of the blast radius is designed into the system long before anything goes wrong. Over time, your architecture concentrates trust into a few anchors: your main identity platform, your collaboration suite, your core data services. When third-party apps plug into those anchors with overly broad permissions, they inherit capabilities that go far beyond their narrow business purpose. At that point, the question is not whether a chain reaction is possible. The question is how quickly it will unfold once a motivated attacker finds that path. Wide permission scopes are one of the clearest drivers. An automation tool asks for rights to read mailboxes across the tenant, access all files in shared drives, or manage all calendars because that is simpler than designing narrow scopes per team. After a few clicks, one vendor has effectively become a superuser in your environment, often relying on long-lived tokens and service accounts that no one regularly revisits. The same pattern appears with shared administrative accounts used only for integrations, roles that are reused across environments, or connectors that can both read and change critical records. From an attacker's point of view, compromising that vendor is no longer a side quest. It is a direct route into systems that matter. Cross-tenant propagation adds another dimension that leaders often underestimate. Many SaaS tools connect your organization not just internally, but outward to customers, partners, and suppliers. When such a tool is compromised, it can push poisoned data into shared platforms, trigger actions in partner environments, or silently exfiltrate information across organizational boundaries using completely legitimate channels. If your mental model of blast radius stops at our tenant, you will miss the places where your integration patterns have created shared fates with other companies. Containment then becomes as much an inter-organizational challenge as an internal one. The technical picture is only half the story. The operating model decides how much of this risk you accumulate and how often you are surprised by it. In many organizations, SaaS purchasing has been intentionally decentralized. Business units hold budgets, teams are encouraged to self-serve, and procurement functions focus on speed and commercial terms. Security often arrives late in the process, framed as a review hurdle rather than a design partner. The result is that vendor risk reviews treat each provider in isolation, assume single system failures, and rarely consider how a new app will behave as part of an already complex mesh. Standard due diligence reinforces this blind spot. Questionnaires ask whether the vendor encrypts data at rest, provides penetration test reports, or maintains independent compliance audits. Those topics matter, but they mainly evaluate the vendor's internal controls, not the way it will interact with your environment. The questions that drive chain reaction risk sound different. What exact scopes does this integration request from our identity platform? Can access be limited to specific groups or resources? How are tokens stored, rotated, and revoked on both sides? What happens to our data, workflows, and customers if we have to sever this connection under pressure? If these points are missing, a vendor can pass security review and still be the perfect pivot point in a multi-system breach. Incentives and ownership gaps make the eventual cleanup even more painful. When a third-party incident hits, everyone expects the security team to coordinate response, yet that team may not own the contract, the configuration, or the relationships around the affected app. Procurement might hold the paperwork. A business unit might sponsor the vendor. Operations staff administer the underlying identity platform. No one feels accountable for the integration blast radius. Leaders who want better outcomes have to realign these roles. Integration risk must become an explicit part of buying decisions. Key SaaS connections must have named internal owners, and the people who approve risk up front must be visible and involved when the bill comes due. Containment is not something you bolt on after the fact. It is an architectural property you design toward. That starts with treating integrations as first-class objects in your architecture, not as a miscellaneous detail. You identify your trust anchors, identity, messaging, primary data stores, and define which categories of apps may connect to them, for which purposes, and under which patterns. Instead of a flat list of approved apps, you move toward tiers of trust. Some platforms are allowed deep integration under strict governance. Others operate with limited scopes and segmentation, and experimental tools run with hard limits or in separate environments. This is not bureaucracy for its own sake. It is how you draw the boundaries of tomorrow's incidents today. Identity and access patterns do much of the heavy lifting once that intent is set. Tenant-wide scopes and shared admin accounts should be treated as rare exceptions, not defaults. Integrations can authenticate using narrowly scoped service principles tied to specific groups, resources, or environments instead of broad, shared roles. Just-in-time grants based on workflow approvals can replace blanket, perpetual consent for entire organizations. For your most critical platforms, you may even place certain integrations into dedicated integration tenants or segmented environments, so that a compromise does not give a direct path into production data or privileged identities. None of this requires exotic technology. It requires leaders who are willing to make some vendors and internal teams a bit less comfortable in exchange for resilience. Visibility tools can help make those norms real. Application Programming Interface, API, logs, identity governance platforms, and SaaS Security Posture Management, SSPM, tools can reveal overprivileged integrations, abandoned apps, and suspicious patterns across your tenants. Yet, tooling on its own only produces more noise. The leadership move is to pair that visibility with clear guardrails and enforcement. You define what an unacceptable permission pattern looks like, how quickly it must be remediated, when an app must be segmented or retired if it cannot comply, and how exceptions are reviewed and documented. Over time, that combination of insight and discipline shifts the culture from anything that works is fine to integrations are part of our security design. Even with deliberate design, chain reactions are hardest when the spark comes from outside your control. A third-party vendor publishes a breach notice, perhaps shares some early details and forensic indicators, and suddenly your team must act on incomplete information. This is where having playbooks specifically for someone else's incident makes a real difference. The first move in those playbooks is always scoping. You want to quickly know where the app is deployed, which identities and groups it touches, what permissions it holds, and which business processes depend on it right now. If that information lives in scattered consoles and tribal knowledge, you will spend the most precious hours of an incident just building a map. Good playbooks accept that you may need to act before you have perfect certainty. That means defining in advance how you will pull a kill switch on high-risk integrations. You pre-plan how to revoke tokens, disable grants, and sever API connections in a controlled way, and you know the thresholds that trigger those steps. For example, you might move from quiet monitoring to full disconnect when a vendor confirms token theft, when your own telemetry shows anomalous behavior linked to the app, or when regulators issue guidance that changes your obligations. On the detection side, you prepare queries and dashboards focused on the integration, unusual login locations, abnormal volumes of API calls, or actions outside normal business hours tied to that app. These are not things you want to invent during a live fire. The human side of the playbook matters just as much as the technical steps. Third-party incidents cross organizational lines by their nature, so your response must span security, operations, procurement, legal, communications, and the sponsoring business unit. Someone needs authority to take an app offline, even if it supports a critical revenue stream. Someone must prepare and deliver messages to customers if their data may have been exposed through a vendor. Someone has to track and document decisions for boards and regulators, including why you acted when you did. Robust playbooks name these roles up front and tie them to specific triggers, communication paths, and documentation standards. After the incident, they also drive structured reviews that examine not only the vendor's failures, but also your own integration patterns and governance choices. At its heart, this topic is about accepting that SaaS risk is no longer about isolated providers. It is about the way trust, identity, and data flow through a mesh that you only partly control. The note-taking app in that war room is not a bizarre outlier. It is a symptom of how easily we let integrations accumulate power. When leaders start to see their SaaS estate as an interconnected graph rather than a static catalog, the central question shifts. It is no longer, is this vendor secure? It becomes, what can this vendor do inside our environment? How far could a compromise travel? And how much of that path have we designed on purpose? For leaders, that shift in mindset changes the work. It pushes you to make permission scopes explicit, to ensure kill switches are not just documented but rehearsed, and to insist on clear ownership for major integrations. It makes tenant-wide by default and whoever installed it owns it unacceptable answers when third parties are wiring into your most critical platforms. It also gives you a better frame for conversations with boards, regulators, and peers. Not about chasing the perfect vendor, but about engineering blast radius and shared fate into something you can live with. The practical next step is to carry this chain reaction lens into the forums you already have. In your architecture or risk reviews, ask how your organization would actually discover, scope, and contain a breach in a seemingly minor SaaS tool, and whether the current answers depend on heroics or on design. In your buying conversations, ask where a new vendor will sit in your trust tiers, what blast radius you are prepared to accept, and how you will know when that boundary has quietly drifted. Those questions do not prevent every breach, but they do decide whether the next one becomes a contained disruption or everyone's incident. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.